Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining ASMGi today for our last webinar of 2021. This is a panel discussion webinar, and we have some terrific panelists, a lot of great information. We're going to get started right now. I just want to remind everybody there is a Q&A box at the bottom, so if you have questions during the webinar, please type them in there. We will try to get to them real time during the discussion. But without further delay, I'm going to turn this over to Steve Racing, CEO of ASMGi. Take it away, Steve.
Great, thank you, Paul. Thanks everyone for sharing your time with us today. What a great topic we have in session today, and a great panel of experts like Paul had mentioned. But we're going to talk some today about improving the nation's cybersecurity and the executive order of 14028 specifically that was issued last year. So, one of the things I want to mention is we have a tremendous panel of experts. So joining us today are Kevin Tabascio from Cleveland Clinic and Tony Baker from Rockwell Automation. Thanks, guys, for being here. It's really, really awesome to have you aboard. Why don't you guys go ahead and do your own introduction? So the attendees can get to know you a little bit.
Sounds good, Steve. So hello, everyone. My name is Tony Baker. I'm the Chief Product Safety and Security Officer at Rockwell Automation. Rockwell Automation is a very large provider of technology and services to operational technologies. In both critical manufacturing, in the federal government. Across a variety of sectors, from oil and gas, energy, to consumer goods. So we work very extensively with critical infrastructure and critical manufacturing companies around the globe.
Yeah, my name is Kevin Tabascio. I manage a team called the Attack Surface Reduction Team. We focus on threats to both IT and operational technology assets within our environment. My team conducts vulnerability management practices, penetration testing, purple teaming, and red teaming against the relative threats to our organization from threat actors around the globe. So we apply those practices both to the standard IT assets like computers and servers, extending it into the network infrastructure, as well as to medical devices and control systems that we have here at Cleveland Clinic.
Awesome. And I think we have first of all, it's just wonderful to have you guys with us. And I think we have a unique opportunity in it to gain the perspective of both a vendor or a provider of the product side of the OT world, and also a consumer or an owner operator of that technology. And so we'll get to hear how both of those perspectives play into the Executive Order 14028 and various different other elements. So I think we're going to start with Tony. So why don't you go ahead, Tony, and kick it off?
Sounds great. So earlier this year, back in May, actually, it was released, the Executive Order 14028, improving the nation's cybersecurity. And this is not the first time such a something like this was released to market, but this one has a different tone and a different look versus many of the ones that came before it. And that's what's really interesting about this most recent executive order. And if we just kind of take a step back and look at some data around it, this is a significantly more robust executive order, 6 times actually larger than any of the other executive orders looking at cybersecurity in the past. And not only was it larger, but the White House actually went in and listed out some very specific actionable directives that must be completed in a time frame. And so we're starting to see that it's not just a generic statement of, hey, we need to be doing these things. It's we will go do, and we're going to do it in this fashion. And so it's really engaging a lot of the different agencies and groups within the federal government to move with speed, just given the urgency and the critical nature that's recognized with respect to cybersecurity. And you'll see that a lot of this was triggered from some of these recent events. Look at SolarWinds, look at some of the breaches that we've seen unfold in recent years, and it's really call it raised the temperature in us looking at our own capabilities as a federal government and us in the broader scheme, right? And as well as providers of technology to serve those markets, we'll call commercial technologies to serve those federal markets. And one of the big differences in this particular executive order versus the previous ones is the explicit call out of operational technology and recognizing that there are networks, capabilities, areas of these organizations and systems that don't traditionally classify as IT, that have different people, different areas of different folks that are responsible for them. And so they've really expanded the scope and really recognized that OT and IT are part of this overall federal system that needs secure. So very different, a different tone, a different tact, and definitely recognition of the importance of that operational technology element moving forward. So I think those are really important. Next slide.
And honestly, I think one of the key elements and the key thing for people to understand is that security is such a concern because so much money is spent and wasted. And, like even the Colonial Pipeline thing, right? The gas lines on the East Coast, there's a lot of impact to consumers of this country that are happening as a result of, the residual of data breaches and those things. And this executive order is an example of the government saying, enough, right? We need to do something proactively about this to kind of turn the tide and those kind of things. And I think that's one of the things that really separates this executive order from the attempts in the past.
And I think it's also that recognition of when you look at future warfare, right? And you look at the importance of these systems and how these systems can be used in those type of warfare scenarios, whether it's disruption, like oil and gas pipelines, being able to shut down the economy, destabilize your home can potentially impact you. And I think that was some recent commentary from a discussion that Brian Krebs had with some media. But getting back to the executive order, there's really 7 areas of focus that they've outlined in this document. The first is really information sharing between both the government and private sector. It's well recognized that it's hard to share security information, and a number of groups and organizations have tried to create working groups or consortia or some type of capacity to share information between parties, and it's still very sensitive. It's still very hard. And when you look at the reliance on software as a service providers, infrastructure as a service, any of these types of these new models for delivering of technology or capabilities, that dependency is continuing to grow. And so the government is really recognizing that we cannot have these contractual barriers that's preventing us from having the conversations that we need to be having to better secure our systems. And this first item here is really breaking down those contractual barriers and making sure that people like cloud service providers can share and make available information that's probably unique and those insights that are unique to them because of what they do. And they need to be able to share that with the federal government to provide, to improve the holistic security of what we're doing as a country and as a nation. So really starting to use, trying to push through that contractual barrier that we've seen for many, many years. The next area around modernizing and implementing stronger security standards in the federal government. This is one that's a bit controversial. They are pushing to embrace cloud. They are pushing to embrace zero trust. And we've seen for many years this concept of zero trust. It's not new. It's almost 20 years old, and since it was originally defined. But we're seeing it really start to gain traction, and it's very interesting to see it specifically called out. And so, what they're looking for here is, they're recognizing that we need to have a common approach, and they've asked, NIST in CISA and to work with FedRAMP to really outline what are the best practices and how are we going to move the cloud responsibly, but embrace the security capabilities that it provides. And in so doing, allow us to really help centralize and understand how we can secure those systems. And so it's not a foolhardy jump into cloud, but it's saying we know that that's where we need to go, but we need to make sure that as a federal government, we know how we're going to get there. And they've assigned those groups to make sure that we're laying the framework for us to do that. And so, for many people, especially in the OT side of things, the cloud has been a very scary place. And so we're going to continue to see that push, that embrace of that type of movement looking into the future. The third one, improve software supply chain security. This really goes back to, I mentioned SolarWinds earlier. It's around the reliance on commercial technologies to enable these systems or capabilities. The government, can't develop everything on their own. There's, that'd be a tremendous undertaking, and they're seeing, and there's concern that providers of technology are not doing the things they need to be doing to provide secure products, to manage those products over the life cycle, of their support life cycle. And so they've really laid out quite an extensive list around, can our suppliers, following a security development life cycle, are they doing penetration testing? Are they doing vulnerability assessments? Are they doing code reviews? Do they have the ability to attest that they've done these things and demonstrate that to their downstream customers? There's also quite a bit of wording around making sure that they're managing the software dependencies within those packages, and they've used the term software bill of materials. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the slides to come. But making sure that as a technology provider, you're responsible for the code that you write and the code that you include, whether you wrote it or not. And so that's a really important part of recognizing those upstream and downstream dependencies and how securities flow through these technologies into these systems, to these running systems. Also looking at the establishment of a cybersecurity safety review board. And this is looking at Department of Homeland Security to take a step back after a significant cyber incident and to basically do a root cause analysis. What happened? How do we improve? And making sure that we're looking at this across multiple agencies and groups within the federal government, and we're learning on how we can get better, and prevent these things from occurring. They also noticed that the playbooks around cyber incidents, vary greatly depending on which agency or group you work with, whether it be FBI, NSA, DHS. There was quite a bit of variability in how an incident would be managed and handled. And just given the size of this problem, we need to leverage our resources effectively to support the complexity of these systems. And they want to see all of these agencies work together to make sure that we understand how we can most effectively work together to address a cyber incident in a way that's common across us. And so
right. I think one of the challenges to Tony is just even which organization is going to have jurisdiction and take precedent over the other organizations. I think that's one of the big challenges, right?
Yeah, I definitely think there's going to be some debates and who do you call first? Absolutely. Right. And so that's really a process thing, right? It's a standardization of process. The next piece is that detection capability, and so they're looking at EDR capabilities within the government. So endpoint detection response. What instrumentation do we have in these federal systems to proactively identify security threats and begin to respond to them? And so looking at technologies, looking at architectures, they're looking at how can we start to really make sure that we have a capability to proactively identify and respond. And the last piece, this improve investigative and remediation capabilities, is looking at data. Really, it's what are the things that are important for us to have logs, and how do we and where do we keep those logs, and what's the important elements of those logs. And so, I think a couple of these are process, a couple of these are people, and some of these are really around data and the things that we need to be successful should an incident occur. So at a high level, these are the areas where that executive order really touched on, and there's a couple key themes that I just wanted to hit. The first being information sharing. This is a big part of what they see success looks like in the future. End users or the federal government in this instance wants to be secure, but they need collaboration and support from their providers on how these systems are working and insight into the overall environment so that they can make better decisions. And so they're really looking to establish that flow of information and really tighten those relationships up with their service providers in IT and OT, examples like cloud and others. The modernization piece, it's really that embracing of the cloud. It's the embracing of zero trust as a concept. And if you're not familiar with zero trust, the NIST recently released a nice overview of how they're interpreting and looking at zero trust in organizations today. And the concept is really, that systems, should be able to evaluate and continuously evaluate the trustworthiness of devices, of people as they connect to those systems. That trust should not be assumed. And devices and connections and people should not be allowed to freely move between systems. Many architectures today, they don't have that level of rigor on upfront enforcement to prevent those types of connections. And then there's also that supply chain piece, that software bill of materials, that ability for commercial technology providers to show that they're doing the right things, they're following their security development lifecycle practices, they're doing the penetration testing, they're doing all of those things, but they're also managing their upstream providers of whether it be licensed software or open software or open source software. As a technology provider, you're responsible for all of that content within your product, and you need to find a way to mitigate that risk or quickly resolve it and to support your downstream customers.
Right. And we just had this discussion internally, right? But if you're a software developer, your manager's probably tapping you on the shoulder like 100 times a day. Are you done yet? Are you done yet? Are you done yet? Right. So if you have something to build, like a date picker is a good example, or a form validation, web applications have all these things in them. Nobody builds that stuff anymore, right? But what we see developers doing is, let's go to Google and find a library, and free is even better, right? So but this is creating challenges from an attack surface standpoint, because it ends up having vulnerabilities in it and being an easily attackable thing. But there are a lot of components embedded within a lot of the software that's, that we use. It's commercially available or custom developed. Either one.
It's not uncommon to see thousands of dependencies, right? I mean, thousands of open source packages used in a commercial product.
Yep, that's correct.
Yeah, I mean, it can be 10 lines of code that somebody grabbed from some website, it could be open source, commercial, and like Tony said, have dependencies of dependencies of dependencies.
Right.
Certain languages and certain architectures even kind of lend themselves to even more packages. If you look at something like some of the JavaScript frameworks and things, they may pull in hundreds of different packages to make a solution. So,
right.
and it's also the culture too. I mean, you have to ensure that, developers realize, like, hey, by bringing something in, they're potentially adding risk to the product. To have the tracking and capabilities, to understand and manage all that. It's a big operation to manage all that.
But they honestly have to balance that against, like, recreating the wheel, right?
Yeah,
sure.
Like I remember software developer. I'm so old that people were building clocks, right? Right. Nobody would write software to build a clock today. That's it's phenomenal. But you do have to balance that paradigm for sure.
And a lot of times we joke around. It's open source is free, but it's not like a free beer, right? It's more like a free puppy. And you got to take care of it over a long period of time, right?
I left the fair this year with free goldfish. That's what. So
I think just on that last slide, just the one last thing I'll touch on real quick was almost 30% of this document, if you just look at the overall length, going back to just some of the data around it, 30% of it was related to supply chain. I mean, all of that content, it really spelled out. There was a huge focus on we need to make sure the technologies we're using are right for us, and they've got security as part of their design. And so that was a huge focus of this overall document. Yeah, so I guess when we take a step back and we look at this from a vendor perspective, what this really means is, we've got to find a way to continue to be more transparent. And what that means is, if there's services or systems that we're providing as a service, we're going to have to be able to work through those contractual barriers. It means we're going to have to be able to convey the efficacy of our security programs as we write code, as we bring these technologies to market. And when you talk about things like SBOM, it probably means that we're going to have to be able to provide data feeds to our customers, because one of the things that's asking for with SBOM is you need to share what that bill of materials is with the customer, because that federal government now wants to be able to manage and look at all of the content that's in your product that they've now inherited. And so they're going to know the day that that there's a vulnerability in your product, and that's really going to crank up the heat on vendors to really increase that time to respond and time to fix for some of these security vulnerabilities. So it's going to change how we develop and prioritize and fund products. It's going to change how we release, because it's got to be real time. These systems are important, and our customers are going to have an expectation that we're keeping them secure, to the best of our ability. And the government was not shy about their position in all of this. They said, we know we have the power of the federal government. We know what we're asking here is the greater good, and we're going to incentivize the market, and we're going to lead in this space. And so, we fully expect our other customers that are not federal or direct, federal customers or working with the federal government to embrace this and leverage these capabilities themselves to improve their security programs. Yeah. So they were not shy about that.
Right. I think that's a byproduct of, like NIST developing frameworks, around these concepts. I'm pretty sure they'll become best practice anyway, right? At some point. So.
And I think the biggest thing here, right, we talked about before in the very beginning is, very explicit dates and deliverables. And we've continued to see, since May of this year, they're delivering. And so things are moving quickly, content's being produced, and guidance is being made available for comment. And so it's a great opportunity for anybody that's interested to get involved, to provide commentary, provide feedback, because we expect this to continue to move quickly. We don't have all the answers yet, but people are working through it.
Yep. And I think that's a key point, Tony. This executive order came out in May of 2021, and there are things happening. Right. There are things happening right now, and people need to be aware of what's going on for sure. So Kevin, this is an interesting, situation that we're in, because we have, a vendor and presenting, and also an end user of those products. Right. So it'll be great to hear your perspective through along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. So, from this perspective, I've been here at Cleveland Clinic for about 3 years. I was formerly at Rockwell for about 18 years and worked with Tony on a variety of different things over the years. One of the most interesting things about coming into this organization was, truly trying to understand the availability of healthcare and how important that is, especially in light of a global pandemic and all the things that have happened over the last 2 years here. So oftentimes we think about connected medical devices. We think about risks in these devices that are directly touching our patients. They're delivering care, they're monitoring their conditions, they're delivering medications, they're scanning or imaging, during surgical operations, for example. And so, we first kind of look at the security of these medical devices in relation to some of the most important threats that are out there. Ransomware continues to be one of the most important threats to healthcare that could potentially impact availability of care. And so when we talk about this executive order in the context of that, my first interest was to think about how this will reduce risk in our most important threat, which we believe today to be the ransomware actors who are out there. So since coming here, obviously a big focus has been on medical devices, but I also learned there's a lot of industrial controls here in a hospital and a healthcare environment. Things like building automation systems, elevator controls, HVAC is very important for our operating rooms to maintain a proper level of air quality in order to keep our surgical operations going. Refrigeration, everyone's heard about how the special handling of COVID-19 vaccines is so dependent on refrigeration. The extensive network we have of cooler units, both normal temperature as well as the deep cold storage units that they talked about in the news, has also been an area of concern with respect to ransomware and to our availability. Water systems, power systems, you name it, we have it here at Cleveland Clinic. And then we're also kind of surrounded by another layer of sort of general Internet of Things. These are many consumer grade as well as business grade IoT devices. So think about cameras and lighting systems, smart TVs, Xboxes in children's hospitals, for example. All these different things connected to our network. And it's really been interesting to see how this meshes with the IT systems in the areas of sort of the traditional concern and how we blend this program in with the operational technology side as well. So very interesting environment here. There's not too many other places where you get such a cross-functional set of things that need to be protected. And as Tony mentioned, these are all produced by vendors. There's thousands of medical device vendors. There's certainly lots of industrial control vendors and IoT vendors, all potentially impacted by this executive order, who supply these devices to institutions like Cleveland Clinic, and who also supply, more importantly, to the VA, the Veterans Hospital System, which of course is part of the federal government, and which of course these executive orders will apply into that space as well. So next slide, please. So cybersecurity risks in healthcare, first and foremost, we think about patient safety. We think about the potential for any type of harm to occur against or to a patient from a medical device or from a control system that may directly impact their care. The next area of concern is the general availability of care. Healthcare is a 24/7, 365 operation. There is no downtime. There is no ability for stopping or closing a hospital, especially given the circumstances we're under here. And then the last threat is, we talk a lot about information disclosure. So certainly patient health information, personal information, medical records, credit cards, things like that. We put a lot of effort into securing information disclosure here as well. So why is healthcare so vulnerable to ransomware? I think it's really three different areas to focus on. The first is, unfortunately, a willingness to pay ransoms. As I mentioned, the availability of care is so important here. Losing access to our medical records, to our automated systems, certainly affects operations up to the point where potentially stopping care. And we have very extensive backup procedures and things to ensure that never happens. But certainly, with the additional pressure during a pandemic, the potential is there for healthcare institutions to pay ransoms. And so it's the first reason why we see increased attention to healthcare providers. The second is the value of patient health information. There's a lot of different numbers out there that you'll see about patient health records, but generally, you can expect to see $250 or more per patient health record. One of the reasons why is your patient record does not change. You can't get a new credit. You can get a new credit card number. You can get other things fixed when they're disclosed to the public. But your medical record is your personal history. There's nothing you can change about those medical records. And so those medical records are highly valued. They're sold on the black market. And therefore, institutions like us are vulnerable or are targeted in those types of attacks to extract that kind of information. We also see double extortion attacks, which is information is first exfiltrated and then a ransom is set before information is potentially encrypted within the environment, which would stop any ability to back up or restore your operations as well. And then the last reason is a lot of outdated infrastructure and devices. We have, every hospital has lots of legacy devices, unsupported software, insecure protocols, software and devices that were built 10, 15, 20 years ago in many cases. Cybersecurity was not a concern or not dealt with at that time. Cybersecurity investments are sometimes also going to lag other industries. We've seen, financial industries and others who really were, taking kind of a front seat to cybersecurity spending and risk reduction. Healthcare has some ways to go, and oftentimes healthcare institutions haven't been able to invest in the resources in order to bring their infrastructure to a level that reduces risk. So setting the stage for ransomware and how the executive order helps with our top threats, I think there's definitely a couple of key themes, as Tony mentioned, on things that as an end user we're pretty excited about seeing. The increased transparency is very key. We've built a process here to evaluate new devices, new systems coming in the door. Many of the things that are in the executive order are things that we have been pressing vendors for in order to have a clear understanding of the risks that we're taking on by bringing in that system into our environment. Understanding the secure software development lifecycle. How well did the vendor implement security? Did they do the code reviews and penetration testing and vulnerability assessments to understand the risk and be able to reduce that risk to their end customers? The integrity of the source code. How well do they manage change to that source code? Do they have traceability to requirements? Do they know where items came in, and have they tracked those dependencies in order to produce that software bill of materials, which will help us to map vulnerabilities into those products, oftentimes, well before a vendor may even realize that a vulnerability exists in that specific product. Encryption of data was something that was covered, following good methods to encrypt confidential data. If medical records or confidential information is stored in a device or system, it needs to be, we all know it needs to be encrypted at rest. It needs to be encrypted in transit. And so there are elements in the executive order that requires that level of encryption, following the best practices, the best industry standard algorithms, and so on as well. Vulnerability disclosure programs, very important for end users to understand when a vulnerability is discovered and is fixed by a vendor. What do we do about it? And sometimes even talking to customers before there's a patch available. Maybe there's some mitigations that we can do ahead of time, but very important to understand or have vendors disclose vulnerabilities in a transparent way, give us guidance, give us actionable guidance that we can take and mobilize, whether it is a patch or whether it's a feature we can disable or block something with a network control. And then lastly, vulnerability assessments and cybersecurity testing. Just like Tony said, is the vendor pen testing their products? Are there people trained? Can you attest to the type of pen testing and vulnerability scans you've done within the product? Is also something that's very important to us as a customer. Also another area that was really interesting too was the joint public-private partnerships. I think the ability to develop some new approaches to securing critical software. If there's resources that vendors can use and can share. One of the things that's interesting about the medical world is that there are many small vendors. There's a group of 10 or 15 really big medical device vendors, and then there's a lot of really small vendors in this space. 50 employees, 100 employees, and a lot of them lack the resources to maybe go develop some of these processes and implement some of these practices. And so the ability to share more of that common approach and be able to define some of these practices in a way that multiple vendors and hospitals can take advantage of, I feel is a very strong deliverable here. Sharing information on breaches and incidents. We all learn when we can understand what led up to an incident, how an organization responded, and look at how we can get better as a result of that. Same with incident response playbooks, being able to learn from others and see, a standard model for incident response playbooks and look at how can we adopt that, how can we make our system better. So I see that as another key deliverable for end users. And in the standardized software rating system, I think it's kind of almost like the nutrition label you'd expect when you buy, something at the grocery store, to give a really simple way to break down the components and break down the risks contained within a system. So just like on the medical device vendor side, there are many small hospitals around the United States and the world. And so whatever we can do to make it easier for them to consume this and understand the risk they're bringing in, the better they're going to be able to apply their limited resources to reducing risk once it's brought into the organization.
Awesome.
Next slide. So as Tony mentioned, some of the deliverables are already coming through. One of the ones I thought was most interesting was they released a document around security measures for critical software, and they use that to define critical software. And so the executive order applies to this definition of critical software. And it does include things that, software that has direct dependencies upon or is, an operating system, if it has, direct or privileged access to networking or computing resources, has control access to data or operational technology, performs a function critical to trust. So you're in that case, it is a very, broad definition, and includes, features, requiring features like multi-factor authentication, privilege management. So running different parts of the device or system at different privilege levels and restrict sensitive operations to higher privileges, encryption of data, patch management, the ability for logging and monitoring and incident response. I can't even begin to describe how important logging and monitoring is in the context, especially of an attack like ransomware, when you have so many different devices, so many different vendors, to be able to get logs and be able to monitor them in a concise way is very important as well. And so it requires vendors and devices to support those types of standards so that we can log and monitor the quantity of devices that we have here. It also touched a lot too on training and processes. Again, a lot of us think about technology, technical controls and things like that. But it's also important to recognize the people and the processes. As Tony mentioned, secure software development lifecycle is not just a simple check the box activity. It's a culture change. It's a number of processes that vendors have to adopt. It's a number of processes that end users have to adopt in order to take those securable products and keep them at a high level of security within the organization. The people need the knowledge, they need the expertise, they need the time to be able to perform these functions as well. So we can't just look at it as an investment in technology or technical controls within products. We also have to think about the process and the end users who need to run those processes. Next slide. So in summary, will this reduce risk for ransomware? Again, that's one of my top concerns, when I come into work every day. I definitely feel that this is a promising start, but the impact isn't really going to be felt tomorrow. Many of these product life cycles take months and years to be reflected into a new generation of products or even new updates to existing products. As I mentioned, the VA is one of the largest healthcare institutes in the United States. And so they will have the influence to, impact medical vendors and industrial control vendors that happen to work for the VA, which is also probably many of our vendors that we use for medical devices and control systems. So certainly sent a strong message to operators, to enact change. Deliverables are happening. So there's really great momentum to see in this space. No, I don't think anyone can disagree that many of these things called out are really not new. They're really basic cybersecurity hygiene practices that forward-looking institutions already know about and already do, to some degree today. There's no doubt that following those types of practices, will have an impact to improving security, which therefore reduces risk to certain threats. The increased transparency will enable end users like us to do better risk analysis, better understanding of what we're bringing into the environment before we connect it to our network and systems. The ability for us to better understand what controls we can apply to these systems, both at the endpoint level as well as the network level. And how do we handle incident response? How can we see logs? How can we monitor? How can we be prepared for incidents? How can we back up data in a way that if we should be hit with an incident, we're able to restore operations back to that specific device? The SBOM content certainly helps drive our vulnerability management practices on the operational technology side. The thing I fear there is that the vast quantity of data is going to really be overwhelming though. We're certainly going to need help from some of our vendors, some of our cybersecurity tool vendors, to be able to consume that information and be able to give us prioritized information, actionable intelligence that we can use. If every product has a massive bill of materials with multiple tiers of dependencies, it's going to certainly be challenging for us to make sense of that. So I think hopefully the cybersecurity tool vendors are going to get on board, vendors that manage asset inventory, for example, to programmatically consume that information in a way that we can make sense of it, that we can drive action in our organization. Otherwise, it's going to become background noise and it's not really going to help us in the short term. And as I mentioned, the publicly available standards and playbooks certainly help the small to medium entities, whether it's a vendor, whether it's a healthcare institution, whether it's a small manufacturer who doesn't have the resources that a large one does. Thinking about, city-owned water treatment plant where, there aren't a massive cybersecurity team watching the health of the water plant, for example. The things we can do to kind of help these small to medium entities is going to help the overall risk to our critical infrastructure as well. And then lastly, just kind of a little plug. I'm also part of a group from Health and Human Services. We've developed a model contract language, which really includes a lot of these executive order principles that we're using, both within our contract language, as well as kind of making an open source model for contract language. And so it talks about how do you have a conversation with your vendor? How do you codify things like vulnerability disclosure and SBOMs and attack surface of a medical device, for example, in contract language. And so feel free to check that out. It's being ratified right now by the larger Health and Human Services task force that was set up for this to serve as a public-private partnership for healthcare cybersecurity. And we're pretty excited to see that deliverable get out to healthcare in general.
Awesome. Yeah, very interesting perspective. And we're going to move into Q&A pretty quick, but I wanted to mention, I think you made a really good point, Kevin, in like a lot of the principles, the fundamental principles of this executive order are basic security hygiene, right? People should be doing these things anyway, but without a driver behind it, it's really difficult to make it happen. And we have a pretty robust practice in DevSecOps, right? So I've had this conversation with the people in our DevSecOps practice. Like we used to call it just a list. SCA tools have been around, software composition analysis have been around for quite some time, right? So you're able to evaluate code at the code level and identify what components are part of it and dependencies and all those things, right? So the technology to do this exists, right? But we used to call it a basic list, right? So I think even giving it a name like SBOM or a bill of materials is critically important, because then people have something that they can rally around and really stand behind and get it done, especially if it's a requirement and those kind of things, right? So
yeah, I mean, I think most of the things in these executive orders you could trace back to existing NIST resources, back to, you know, IEC 62443. You know, many of these practices are well known. I think it's really the driver being, hey, this is now going to be required to do business. And, you know, it may only technically apply to products that are, you know, bought and consumed by the federal government. But as I said, in healthcare, the VA is probably one of the biggest, you know, consumers of medical devices and control systems from healthcare. So if you're going to sell to the VA, you know, you're likely going to need, you know, if you're going to sell to us, it's probably also something you're selling to the VA. So by effect, it's going to influence the market in that direction. I'm sure many other vendors, just like Tony, are having similar conversations internally and externally about what they do as a result of this. And so, but again, the practices are not unique. Or novel, really. It's more about the momentum and the urgency now to meet those requirements.
Yeah.
If you look at things like SBOM, I think, you know, some of the tools do exist, but I think what the executive order is trying to drive is some of that standardization, information sharing element of it, because the tools don't all output the same thing, and all those outputs aren't good.
Right.
So
not everybody's using the tools either.
Yeah, I mean, and if you look at Rockwell Automation, right? We have 30,000 catalog numbers, right? And so if you're going to manage your bill of materials for every one of those, and not every one of those bill of materials, you know, you can't just assume what comes out of it's good. Right, you actually have to go through and say, you know, does this vulnerability actually exist in my product? Because with open source, you know, just because that's what you don't necessarily incorporate all of it. You might tune it, you might tweak it, right? You might embed it in a way that it's not exposed. And so, so I'd say some of these things have existed, but, you know, trying to use them at scale and to really make this a best practice. I mean, there's innovation to happen there in the market to make it effective, right? Agreed. So. I don't want to oversimplify some of those challenges.
Agreed. Thanks for that clarification. This is the $1 million question. So call it taking advantage of the fact that we have a vendor and an owner operator both on the panel, right? But who's responsible for security? You're providing products, Tony. You're consuming them, Kevin. So who's responsible for security?
You know, I guess I'll start with the vendor perspective. You know, when I look at what we bring to market, you know, at the end of the day, the customer comes to me, right? Regardless of what I put in that product or the decisions that I make as a vendor, am I going to use open source or am I going to build it inside? And so when I look at, you know, how security, you know, responsibility works or ownership works, you know, the owner operator, the supplier of that vendor, you know, the buck stops with that person because they've made decisions on technology and support models and contracts to be successful. And so when you look at security at the end user, at the end of the day, the end user, I think, is responsible. But I think as a vendor, we know they're not going to do it alone, right? They can't do it alone, and we have to support them. But no one's going to accept it if you start pointing just downstream and saying it's all their fault. So I think we have to be very real to understand that as an end user, you're responsible for the system that you've built and you're operating.
Kevin, you have any perspective?
Yeah. As much as I'd love like a vendor to come in and solve all my problems, you know, it's really both. I look at it as, you know, I expect our vendors to sell us products that are securable, and that means that they've been well designed, they've been tested. There's documented transparency about attack surface and risk contained within that device, which then allows us to make good purchasing decisions about which vendor, which products we want to bring in. And then for the one we do bring in, how do we then secure it within our environment? So I think it starts with having, you know, securable products. And I say securable because, you know, just because a vendor does the right things by disabling features out of the box or, you know, forcing a password change from a default password, you know, the end users have to also take that responsibility to enact those features. They have to turn on the password change feature or actually change the password, you know, when prompted. They have to keep those risky features turned off if they're not prepared to accept the risk of those features. They need to patch the devices. They need to be prepared for incident response and be able to monitor those devices. They need to securely dispose of the devices should they contain PII or PHI, and we have to dispose of them at the end of their life cycle. So, I believe both sides have a good amount of responsibility, and we really need each other in order to each of us meet our obligations.
Yep. Great points, guys. When I think about this question, specifically as it relates to this executive order, I think about, like in cloud security, there's this shared responsibility model, right? And then Amazon actually coined the phrase, we're responsible for security of the cloud. And the end user is responsible for security in the cloud, right? So it ends up being, and I think about relating it to device level security, right? So, like Rockwell would be responsible for security of the device, but the Cleveland Clinic or any owner operator would be responsible for the use of that device in their environment, right? And so you would have to wrap security around it. But I think
it's really no different than safety as well, right?
Right.
I mean,
exactly
you have products that can be safely deployed in a safe manner, but then it takes the end user to deploy them and maintain them, in order to maintain that level of safety. It's really very similar in a lot of ways.
Yep. But I will say, and this kind of ties into what your thoughts, Tony, and that is that the owner operator, the end user, is ultimately responsible for security. And like if there's a data breach, for example, if you're putting your data in the cloud and there's a data breach, who is that data, who is that customer, your customer? Who are they going to call, right? Are they going to call Microsoft or Amazon, or are they going to call you? Of course, they're going to call you. So I think ultimately the responsibility lies with the user of that device, but certainly there's a shared responsibility for creating.
Maybe a better term is cascading responsibility model.
Cascading responsibility. Yes, somehow there'll be a term for this, right? But that's so. Here's another question. How do you identify vulnerabilities at the device level, and who fixes them? And so maybe you can reflect on that a little bit.
Yeah. So, my team here, we conduct penetration testing and red teaming exercises against IT and OT systems here. We certainly have identified vulnerabilities and work, with vendors, to get things remediated. But we also, many times we also find, it's kind of like what I was just saying. We find, some of our findings sometimes do apply to the vendor, and we have to go to the vendor for the conversation. But other times we find it's more on the implementation side of that device or system. So, just because a product has a web server, if you turn on HTTPS, then if the vendor offers support for HTTPS, then great. That's a great feature that the vendor offered. If we choose not to turn it on, then that's a whole different conversation. And that's something that then we have to remediate. So we kind of distinguish between like the things the vendor has to fix, the things that we as an IT team have to fix as well. And oftentimes it's a combination of the two. Or sometimes something that we can do internally, even if the vendor can or won't fix something, there may be some things that we can do as well. So it's kind of a complex answer. It's not an easy answer in this case. It's very situational. If it's something inherent in the product, like they chose to have poor encryption for data or something, that's something that a vendor is going to have to deal with and hopefully get a product change out. If it's like you've chosen to do authentication poorly, that could be a vendor problem, or it could be an internal problem. And then we have to work with the internal team to remediate those.
Yep. Before you chime in on this, Tony, Kevin, just for the benefit of the audience, are there scanners that you use to establish or identify vulnerabilities at the device level in the OT network or for medical devices? And if so, are they OT specific or more generic, or are they healthcare specific? Or
so we have a couple different ways. The first is we use one of the common IT focused vulnerability scanners, just like many other organizations. That's periodically scanning the devices, scanning the IT systems, for vulnerabilities. That falls into more of the traditional IT, like think about Patch Tuesday and think about Windows vulnerabilities and so on. For medical devices and in OT, we have more of a passive approach to that. So we have a series of sensors listening and then trying to identify those devices. That system then also maps the identity of that device into the National Vulnerability Database. And so we don't actively scan medical devices. We don't actively scan control systems. There's still too many opportunities to disrupt availability of those devices, unfortunately, by performing those types of network scans. So we're pretty careful about that. We know where our devices are. We do more of a passive listening. We map their identity. And then our tool will go and, sort of map that, okay, based on this version, this identity, we think you have these 5 vulnerabilities across the 1,000 models of this device that you have in your enterprise. And then we can enact the traditional vulnerability response, triaging and understanding it and rolling out patches if appropriate to those devices.
Yeah. Thoughts, Tony?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like we talked about before, I think there's everybody's got a responsibility to be looking, right? Looking and finding and identifying and working with their suppliers or their internal teams to resolve these. So I know at Rockwell Automation, we have a number of teams that are doing penetration testing, right? They're doing vulnerability assessments. They're trying to find this, as soon as we can before it gets shipped to Kevin, right? We want to find this as we're writing the code and before we ship the code. And so, it's all about the shifting left, right? So there's a lot of work that we do internally as part of our security development lifecycle to identify and fix these as soon as and early as we can in the overall process. And one of the things we talked about earlier, it's not just when you're doing development, it's over the life cycle of that product that's really important. So when you're a vendor, right, even if you write the product in year 1, you got 20 more years of support. You got to be reevaluating it, right? Your security controls, your technologies are constantly deprecating, and people are becoming more advanced. Tools are becoming more advanced, and so you have to keep pace, and you're treading water basically with that product. So and I guess just the last comment I'll say is it's also us working with our upstream providers as well, and making sure that we have contract language that we're holding all of our partners to the same standards that we're holding ourselves. You need to be doing penetration testing, threat modeling, all this type of stuff when you design code before we take it in. And so it's multifaceted.
Yeah, it's almost like just saying that Tony and Rockwell's a vendor and we're an owner operator. I mean, Tony's also an end user of things that are going into those products, so he's got the same concerns to those vendors that customers like us have to him. And then our patients are like our customers in a way, right? And they look at us in the same way that someone would look at a vendor, and the types of responsibilities. So it really is that cascading effect, like Tony mentioned.
Yep. If you identify a vulnerability, Tony, a patch has to be developed for that. Is that something that you would develop and release it to an end user or an owner operator like Kevin to deploy, install if it's an existing piece of technology?
Yeah, I think it all depends on the technology stack, right? I mean, there's some things where it's a cloud backend and we can just fix it, right? But for technologies that we ship or that are off the shelf type things, we have to issue patches. We have to do vulnerability disclosures. We have a product security incident response team that coordinates with external researchers, that works with our internal development teams to basically say, hey, we have a vulnerability that we need to make the market aware of. We'll do a disclosure. We'll work with the engineering teams to release a patch, and we'll inform the market. We'll work with agencies like CISA to make sure that's well broadcasted and that it's hitting all of the relevant users to the best of our ability, and really enable people like Kevin, who's using those tools or just due to his due diligence and following all of the latest Rockwell automation disclosures, right, can go take action, right? Mm-hmm. So a big part of what we do is we disclose and we broadcast to make sure our customers know that there's something that they need to look at.
Yep. I want to get to some customer questions. I'll get to one, and I'll actually tie it to closing remarks. But there's a customer question about, can you explain the 3 main components? I think you had a slide on this, Tony, where you talked about information sharing Zero Trust and the SBOM. Can you explain those in a little more depth, and maybe in closing remarks you can just reflect on thoughts about this executive order and what it means to the industry?
I think the the information sharing is really around understanding that we talk about this cascading responsibility model, that although as an end user you're responsible for your systems, you have a dependency on some of these underlying technologies that are becoming much more complex. You're looking at cloud as an example. You talked about Amazon. How can the federal government work with these agencies that are providing these live services or capabilities and that have great context of what's happening more broadly? And they want to make sure that they can share relevant security information with the federal government so that they can move quickly and precisely to mitigate security risk. So information sharing is really around getting rid of those contractual barriers to allow better collaboration between groups. The modernization was a big one, moving things to cloud, but doing it deliberately and with purpose and with good understanding of how to best do it, because they see the end goal as having better security if they do it the right way, and making sure that architecture and everyone's moving in the right direction. And they've used terms like zero trust to help identify what that means. And then lastly, that SBOM or the supply chain, understanding the dependency on commercial technologies and making sure that these commercial technology, or we'll call it, these companies are developing and building security in and supporting it and can attest to it, and all the technology they package along with it. I mean, those are three very key elements to this overall executive order.
Awesome. Awesome. Kevin, any thoughts?
No, I think I'm good.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for attending, and I want to get to some special offers for the attendees of the session today. So, and be respectful of everyone's time, but I do want to emphasize how awesome it was to have you guys on a panel again together, and just really very, very quality job, and great topic. Special offers for attendees. So one of the things that we provided at ASMGi is an external view. It's a security scorecard report. But anyway, it's outside in, or the view of the attacker. So if you want to get a perspective of what your network looks like from the attacker's view, let us know, and we'll provide you a report for that. And also, if there are 3 vendors that provide service to you, and maybe Kevin, you want to report on Rockwell, just so you know, right? But that's anyway. If you want to report on yourself and up to 3 vendors that you use for delivering service, we're happy to deliver that to you. Also, DevSecOps, I mentioned earlier, we have a pretty robust practice in DevSecOps, and we're doing a lot of the things that are mentioned in this executive order as part of that DevSecOps practice. So that's we have an assessment that it's a maturity-based assessment, just to establish how well you do at certain aspects across the life cycle of software development and those kind of things. If you're interested in that, just please let us know, and we'll by all means be able to perform that assessment at 50% off. So that's in any event, thank you so much for attending today. I want to thank my panel again, and thank the attendees for sharing their time.
Thanks for having us, Steve. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Cheers.